Inspirational quotes by George Bernard Shaw. These inspirational quotes by George Bernard Shaw have been selected from a wide range of his writings, mainly his plays and the vast collection of letters he wrote, not just to friends but to newspapers and organizations. Read these quotes and inspire yourself. These quotes will help you to become a great and intellectual person. The secret to success is to offend the greatest number of people. George Bernard Shaw. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. George Bernard Shaw. Life isn't about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. George Bernard Shaw. Statistics show that of those who contract the habit of eating, very few survive. George Bernard Shaw. A learned man is an idler who kills time by study. George Bernard Shaw. Democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve. George Bernard Shaw. Just do what must be done? This may not be happiness, but it is greatness. George Bernard Shaw. Inspirational quotes by George Bernard Shaw. Patriotism is your conviction that this country is superior to all others, because you were born in it. George Bernard Shaw. The power of accurate observation is commonly called cynicism by those who have not got it. George Bernard Shaw. Do not do unto others as you would that they should do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. George Bernard Shaw. Science never solves a problem without creating 10 more. George Bernard Shaw. The test of a man or woman's breeding is how they behave in a quarrel. George Bernard Shaw. If all the economists were laid end to end, they'd never reach a conclusion. George Bernard Shaw. Take care to get what you like or you will be forced to like what you get. George Bernard Shaw. There are two tragedies in life. One is to lose your heart's desire. The other is to gain it. George Bernard Shaw. Famous quotes by George Bernard Shaw. Looking for famous quotes by George Bernard Shaw? Don't worry, read these famous quotes and grow your knowledge. Advertisement is a foolish expedient for making idle people believe they are doing something very clever, when they are only wasting their time. George Bernard Shaw. Happy is the man who can make a living by his hobby. George Bernard Shaw. A life spent making mistakes is not only more honorable, but more useful than a life spent doing nothing. George Bernard Shaw. Beware of the man who does not return your blow. He neither forgives you nor allows you to forgive yourself. George Bernard Shaw. Liquor is the chloroform which enables the poor man to endure the painful operation of living. George Bernard Shaw. War does not decide who is right but who is left. George Bernard Shaw. Everything happens to everybody sooner or later if there is time enough. George Bernard Shaw. My main reason for adopting literature as a profession was that, as the author is never seen by his clients, he need not dress respectably. George Bernard Shaw. Silence is the most perfect expression of scorn. George Bernard Shaw. Famous quotes by George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. George Bernard Shaw. Better keep yourself clean and bright. You are the window through which you must see the world. George Bernard Shaw. Marriage is an alliance entered into by a man who can't sleep with the window shut, and a woman who can't sleep with the window open. George Bernard Shaw. Related Charles Dickens quotes. The thought of 2,000 people crunching celery at the same time horrified me. George Bernard Shaw. The best place to find God is in a garden. You can dig for him there. George Bernard Shaw. The trouble with her is that she lacks the power of conversation, but not the power of speech. George Bernard Shaw. You have learnt something. That always feels at first as if you have lost something. George Bernard Shaw. Best quotes of George Bernard Shaw. Here is the best collection of gigabytes Shaw's quotes, his quotes always highly intellectual and knowledgeable. Advertisement. If history repeats itself, and the unexpected always happens, how incapable must man be of learning from experience? George Bernard Shaw. Every man over 40 is a scoundrel. George Bernard Shaw. If women were particular about men's characters, they would never get married at all. George Bernard Shaw. The only service a friend can really render is to keep up your courage by holding up to you a mirror in which you can see a noble image of yourself. George Bernard Shaw. A miracle, my friend, is an event which creates faith. George Bernard Shaw. Like all young men, you greatly exaggerate the difference between one young woman and another. George Bernard Shaw. Liberty means responsibility. That is why most men dread it. George Bernard Shaw. Doing what needs to be done may not make you happy, but it will make you great. George Bernard Shaw. Some look at things that are, and ask why. I dream of things that never were. George Bernard Shaw. Best quotes of George Bernard Shaw. Success does not consist in never making mistakes, but in never making the same one a second time. George Bernard Shaw. Hatred is the coward's revenge for being intimidated. George Bernard Shaw. The golden rule is that there are no golden rules. George Bernard Shaw. Related Handmaid's Tale quotes. The perfect love affair is one which is conducted entirely by post. George Bernard Shaw. We are made wise not by the recollection of our past, but by the responsibility for our future. George Bernard Shaw. When a thing is funny, search it carefully for a hidden truth. George Bernard Shaw. Do not do unto others as you expect they should do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. Without art, the crudeness of reality would make the world unbearable. George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw quotes on education. Educate yourself with these educational quotes by Gigabytes Shaw. Definitely you will learn a lot of things from here. Advertisement. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one. The being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. George Bernard Shaw. Censorship ends in logical completeness when nobody is allowed to read any books except the books that nobody reads. George Bernard Shaw. You use a glass mirror to see your face. You use works of art to see your soul. George Bernard Shaw. When a stupid man is doing something he is ashamed of, he always declares that it is his duty. George Bernard Shaw. Without art, the crudeness of reality would make the world unbearable. George Bernard Shaw. Do not waste your time on social questions. What is the matter with the poor is poverty. What is the matter with the rich is uselessness. George Bernard Shaw. Both optimists and pessimists contribute to society. The optimist invents the airplane, the pessimist the parachute. George Bernard Shaw. Beware of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes Shaw quotes. The liar's punishment is not in the least that he is not believed, but that he cannot believe anyone else. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. If you cannot get rid of the family skeleton, you may as well make it dance. George Bernard Shaw. We have no more right to consume happiness without producing it than to consume wealth without producing it. George Bernard Shaw. I never resist temptation, because I have found that things that are bad for me do not tempt me. George Bernard Shaw. Related Fred Hampton quotes, "What is life but a series of inspired follies? The difficulty is to find them to do. Never lose a chance, it doesn't come every day." George Bernard Shaw. Youth is wasted on the young. George Bernard Shaw. A government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul. George Bernard Shaw. Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes Shaw quotes about life. Gigabytes Shaw talks more about human life. He gathered a lot of knowledge during his entire life. Hear what he learned from his entire life quoted in lines. Life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it ceases to be serious when people laugh. George Bernard Shaw. My way of joking is to tell the truth. It's the funniest joke in the world. George Bernard Shaw. A fashion is nothing but an induced epidemic. George Bernard Shaw. Clever and attractive women do not want to vote. They are willing to let men govern as long as they govern men. George Bernard Shaw. Parentage is a very important profession, but no test of fitness for it is ever imposed in the interest of the children. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. Choose silence of all virtues, for by it you hear other men's imperfections, and conceal your own. George Bernard Shaw. A fool's brain digests philosophy into folly, science into superstition, and art into pedantry. Hence university education. George Bernard Shaw. Power does not corrupt men. Fools, however, if they get into a position of power, corrupt power. George Bernard Shaw. There is only one religion, though there are 100 versions of it. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes Shaw quotes. Confusing monogamy with morality has done more to destroy the conscience of the human race than any other error. George Bernard Shaw. Few people think more than 2 or 3 times a year. I have made an international reputation for myself by thinking once or twice a week. George Bernard Shaw. When a man wants to murder a tiger, he calls it sport. When a tiger wants to murder him, he calls it ferocity. George Bernard Shaw. Use your health, even to the point of wearing it out. That is what it is for. Spend all you have before you die. Do not outlive yourself. George Bernard Shaw. Related Pride and Prejudice quotes. The secret of being miserable is to have leisure to bother about whether you are happy or not. The cure for it is occupation, because occupation means preoccupation. And the preoccupied person is neither happy nor unhappy, but simply alive and active. That is why it is necessary to happiness that one should be tired. George Bernard Shaw. Advertisement. In a battle, all you need to make you fight is a little hot blood and the knowledge that it's more dangerous to lose than to win. George Bernard Shaw. In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. George Bernard Shaw. Beauty is all very well at first sight. But whoever looks at it when it has been in the house 3 days? George Bernard Shaw. Love is a gross exaggeration of the difference between one person and everybody else. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes. Shaw quotes about knowledge. Knowledge quotes by George Bernard Shaw can be quite useful in every person's life. There are many benefits of reading inspirational quotes, and here are some of them. Forgive him, for he believes that the customs of his tribe are the laws of nature. George Bernard Shaw. A happy family is but an earlier heaven. George Bernard Shaw. The only man I know who behaves sensibly is my tailor. He takes my measurements anew each time he sees me. The rest go on with their old measurements and expect me to fit them. George Bernard Shaw. The only way to avoid being miserable is not to have enough leisure to wonder whether you are happy or not. George Bernard Shaw. The fact that a believer is happier than a skeptic is no more to the point than the fact that a drunken man is happier than a sober one. The happiness of credulity is a cheap and dangerous quality of happiness, and by no means a necessity of life. George Bernard Shaw. In an ugly and unhappy world, the richest man can purchase nothing but ugliness and unhappiness. George Bernard Shaw. We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing. George Bernard Shaw. Gigabytes. Shaw quotes about life. The plain working truth is that it is not only good for people to be shocked occasionally, but absolutely necessary to the progress of society that they should be shocked pretty often. George Bernard Shaw. When two people are under the influence of the most violent, most insane, most delusive, and most transient of passions, they are required to swear that they will remain in that excited, abnormal, and exhausting condition continuously until death do them part. George Bernard Shaw. People who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those who are doing it. George Bernard Shaw. We learn from experience that men never learn anything from experience. George Bernard Shaw. Related. The Alchemist quotes, "That is the injustice of a woman's lot. A woman has to bring up her children, and that means to restrain them, to deny them things they want, to set them tasks, to punish them when they do wrong, to do all the unpleasant things. And then the father, who has nothing to do but pet them and spoil them, comes in when all her work is done and steals." George Bernard Shaw. Hell is full of musical amateurs. George Bernard Shaw. No man ever believes that the Bible means what it says. He is always convinced that it says what he means. George Bernard Shaw. He knows nothing and thinks he knows everything. That points clearly to a political career. George Bernard Shaw. It is a curious sensation, the sort of pain that goes mercifully beyond our powers of feeling. When your heart is broken, your boats are burned, nothing matters anymore. It is the end of happiness and the beginning of peace. George Bernard Shaw.